The winter garden at Rosewood Manor was quiet, a pale frost glinting on the delicate petals of the winter roses. Even in the heart of December the flowers had stubbornly bloomed, their crimson heads almost defiant against the cold. Yet the serenity of the estate had been shattered that morning, when the body of Lady Edith Harrowby was discovered in the drawing-room, slumped over her writing desk with an expression of frozen surprise. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, and no weapon within reach. It was as if she had simply collapsed while engrossed in some private thought. But a single curious detail puzzled the local constables. A tiny, perfectly carved ivory rose had been placed upon the blank sheet of paper before her, its petals immaculate and unnatural in their precision. The servants were in uproar, whispering that the house was cursed, that Lady Edith had been meddling in affairs beyond her station. Yet Inspector Blake, accustomed to the theatrics of the upper class, dismissed such notions with a polite frown. "The question," he muttered to himself, "is not why she died, but how." The room was locked from the inside, the key still hanging on a hook just beside the fireplace, and the doors bore no signs of forced entry. The windows, heavy with frost, were securely latched. Everything suggested that the murderer was either incredibly clever, or the death was a tragic accident. Miss Marple arrived in the afternoon, her carriage crunching over the frosted gravel path. Her eyes, sharp despite the softness of her elderly features, took in the scene with a practised calm. The inspector led her through the drawing-room, careful not to disturb the exact arrangement of the desk or the ivory rose. "We found no poison, no wound, no evidence of violence," Blake said, his frustration barely masked. "She seems to have simply expired. And yet," he gestured toward the rose, "what on earth could this mean?" Miss Marple leaned closer, her fingers brushing lightly over the delicate petals. "Ivory, you say?" she murmured. "And carved? Curious." She glanced around, her gaze lingering on the small details, the angle of the desk, the slight smear of ink on the blotter, the faint indentation of a letter pressed into the paper. "It is the sort of clue that seems meaningless at first, but is almost always placed deliberately by someone who wishes to mislead. The question is, to what end?" The household, an uneasy mix of relatives and staff, gathered in the drawing-room, their faces pale and expectant. There was Lord Harrowby, rigid and distant, his grief carefully measured; Miss Clarissa, Lady Edith's niece, who trembled visibly but avoided anyone's gaze; and the butler, Mr. Clements, whose stoic demeanour hid the faintest tremor of agitation. Each of them had a plausible reason to be in the house at the time of the death, yet none could account for the tiny rose. Miss Marple observed them quietly, noting small inconsistencies, the way Clarissa's fingers fidgeted with a handkerchief, how Clement's eyes shifted toward the desk when speaking, and how Lord Harrowby's mourning seemed almost performative. The crime scene itself held further oddities. The ink bottle on the desk had been recently filled, and a half-written letter lay open, the writing neat but interrupted. The paper bore no fingerprints beyond Lady Edith's own, suggesting that whatever had happened occurred swiftly, without struggle. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a photograph of Lady Edith's late husband leaned slightly to one side, a detail that Blake had initially dismissed but which Miss Marple now found intriguing. "Small gestures often speak louder than dramatic acts," she murmured, noting the angle of the photograph in relation to the window light. What troubled Miss Marple most was the apparent randomness of the ivory rose. It could have been a token of love, a symbolic message, or a deliberate attempt to confuse the investigators. And yet, nothing about Lady Edith suggested a private life shrouded in mystery. She was methodical, reserved and known for her quiet intellect. It seemed improbable that she would attract such elaborate attention. The pieces did not fit together naturally, yet Miss Marple had long learned that the most unsolvable crimes often hinged upon the smallest, most overlooked truths. She moved toward the window, her eyes scanning the frost-encrusted garden where the winter roses bloomed defiantly against the cold. Something about the careful alignment of the blooms, the precise placement of the furniture, and the solitary ivory rose struck her as a pattern waiting to be deciphered. No matter how trivial a detail appears, she murmured to herself, it can be the key to unravelling the whole mystery. As the day wore on and the household remained under a veil of unease, Miss Marple sat quietly, sipping her tea and letting her mind untangle the threads of the seemingly impossible crime. The body of Lady Edith remained in the drawing-room, and the single ivory rose gleamed in the winter light, an enigmatic symbol that promised answers to those patient enough to discern their meaning. In the silence of Rosewood Manor, a story of subtle intrigue and hidden motives was beginning to unfold, and Miss Marple was certain that every riddle, no matter how carefully concealed, could eventually be solved. Miss Marple spent the evening moving quietly through the house, her steps measured and deliberate, her eyes catching nuances that would have escaped even the most observant of policemen, while Inspector Blake busied himself. With interviews and official reports, she lingered in the periphery, taking in the minutiae of the household that spoke volumes in silence. The servants were polite, yet stiff, their eyes flicking toward one another as if communicating in some unspoken code. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn not to what was openly displayed, but to the subtle disturbances, the small, almost imperceptible deviations from the ordinary rhythm of the house. In the drawing-room, she noticed first the angle of the blotter. While everyone else had merely glanced at the half-finished letter, she observed that the page was slightly curled on one corner, and that the ink, though dry, bore a faint smudge that seemed inconsistent with Lady Edith's careful penmanship. She crouched briefly, examining the desk from different perspectives, and noted the precise placement of the ivory rose. Its position, she realized, was not arbitrary, it was slightly off-center, as if it had been adjusted by someone conscious of the way it would appear to an onlooker. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple caught the butler, Mr. Clements, shifting uneasily behind the doorway. His posture was impeccable, yet his hands trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. Unlike the other staff, who seemed resigned to their grief or intimidated by the presence of the police, Clement's discomfort carried the hint of something else. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. Miss Marple made a mental note, not to accuse but to observe. Often the truth was revealed less in words than in hesitation. As she wandered into the adjacent study, she noticed a small, leather-bound notebook lying half-hidden beneath a pile of letters. The binding was worn, the edges frayed, and the cover bore the faint impression of a floral motif that mirrored the winter roses outside. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Lady Edith's C. Airful script, but here and there were abrupt annotations, almost like shorthand, that hinted at personal thoughts never shared aloud. One particular note caught her attention, a cryptic reference to the visitor at twilight alongside a series of dates marked in the margins. Miss Marple's fingers traced the letters gently. She had seen this habit before, one that often indicated an intention to remind oneself of something delicate or secret. Meanwhile, Inspector Blake was focused on conventional leads, questioning the household and cataloguing possessions, unaware that the very objects he passed over held subtler clues. Miss Marple, however, noted small contradictions among the statements she overheard. Clarissa, Lady Edith's niece, insisted she had been tending to the conservatory all morning, yet a faint smear of garden soil on the back of her glove suggested otherwise. Lord Harrowby, poised and controlled, professed ignorance of his wife's recent interactions, yet a faint scent of lavender, matching the perfume she favoured, clung to his scarf in a way that could not have been accidental. Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the fireplace mantel once more. The photograph of Lady Edith's late husband, which she had earlier found slightly askew, now seemed to align with the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. It suggested not merely a decorative choice, but a deliberate placement, one meant to be noticed or perhaps to direct attention subtly. Beneath it, on the polished surface, lay a pair of spectacles that had clearly not been worn recently. They were dusted, yet faintly smudged in a pattern that implied someone had handled them in haste. Miss Marple's attention then turned outward. Through the frost-covered windows, she observed the winter roses swaying lightly in the chill wind. It occurred to her that the blooms, so vividly alive against the icy backdrop, mirrored the precision of the ivory rose indoors. Someone in the household possessed a meticulous hand and a fondness for symbolism, whether as a message, a threat, or a diversion remained to be seen, yet the alignment of these small but deliberate signs suggested that the death was no random accident. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair, quietly knitting while her mind traced the outlines of the puzzle. The staff continued to whisper, the inspector continued his paperwork, and the house settled into a tense hush. She could feel the first threads of deception beginning to unravel, an uneasy glance, a hesitated word, an object slightly out of place, but the full picture remained obscured, hidden behind layers of propriety and fear. Somewhere within the calm surface of Rosewood Manor lay the truth, veiled in deliberate misdirection, and Miss Marple knew that patience, keen observation, and an unerring instinct for human nature would soon draw it into the light. Even as she pondered the subtle clues, her gaze returned once more to the ivory rose on the desk. It gleamed in the lamplight, almost mocking in its perfection. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "No detail is too small," she murmured, "and nothing that seems trivial is ever meaningless. The answer is here, hidden in plain sight, and soon, very soon, it will be found." By the next morning, the household was tense with expectation. Inspector Blake had organized a formal round of questioning, and one by one, the residents and staff were brought before him in the drawing-room, each offering their account of the morning Lady Edith had died. Miss Marple observed quietly from a corner, her knitting resting in her lap, her eyes sharp and patient. She had learned long ago that human nature was rarely straightforward. The truth often lay not in the spoken words, but in the spaces between them, in what people omitted or emphasized too eagerly. Clarissa Harrowby was first. She recounted with trembling precision how she had spent the morning in the conservatory, checking on the winter roses, and had only discovered her aunt when summoned by the butler. Her tone was careful, almost rehearsed, and she avoided looking directly at her uncle or the inspector. Miss Marple noticed the faint traces of soil still embedded beneath her fingernails and the smudge of ink on her glove. A simple mistake, or a subtle signal that her account was not entirely accurate? Miss Marple filed it away, silently noting that Clarissa seemed far too intent on asserting her innocence. Next came Lord Harrowby. He was composed, his grief restrained, bordering on theatrical. He claimed to have been occupied with correspondence in his study, unaware of any unusual events in the house. Yet Miss Marple caught the subtle aroma of lavender clinging to his coat, exactly the fragrance Lady Edith favoured, and the slight crease in his sleeve, as though he had been hastily moving about in a way that contradicted his statement. His eyes avoided hers briefly, a flicker that passed in an instant but did not escape her attention. The butler, Mr. Clements, was more guarded. He spoke sparingly, asserting only that he had been attending to household duties and had not entered the drawing-room until after the discovery. Yet when questioned about the ivory rose, his voice hesitated ever so slightly, and his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his cuffs. Miss Marple noticed that his responses, though polite, were measured, almost rehearsed. Someone who is nervous but truthful is usually consistent under repeated questioning. Someone who conceals something becomes progressively more cautious with each inquiry. She filed that observation away as well. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitcomb, was eager to cooperate, volunteering more details than were asked for. She described Lady Edith's routine, her precise habits, and even her diet, down to the smallest detail. Yet her eagerness seemed to carry a subtle tension, as though the more she revealed, the more she hoped to protect herself from suspicion. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. People who overcompensate often reveal as much as they conceal. Even the gardener, a taciturn man named Humphrey, contributed his account. He had been pruning the rose bushes in the frost, he said, and had noticed nothing unusual. Yet he glanced repeatedly toward the drawing-room, and a faint smear of dirt on his coat suggested he had recently moved through the house in ways he had not mentioned. Miss Marple noted that, although he claimed ignorance, his eyes betrayed the awareness of something significant, something deliberately omitted. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple began to detect subtle contradictions among the statements. Clarissa insisted she had not touched her aunt's desk, yet traces of her glove prints were faintly visible on the polished surface. Lord Harrowby claimed to have been in his study, yet the faint lavender scent suggested proximity to Lady Edith. Clement's hesitations were telling, and Mrs. Whitcomb's overzealous recounting seemed designed to distract. Each account, while plausible in isolation, began to form a pattern when considered together: discrepancies in timing, minor inconsistencies in physical evidence, and hints of concealed movement throughout the house. Miss Marple also noted interactions between the witnesses. When Clarissa mentioned her aunt's recent letters, Mr. Clement's hands twitched ever so slightly, and Lord Harrowby's expression shifted imperceptibly. These were the subtle cues of tension, the invisible undercurrent of fear and concealment. She realized that while the death of Lady Edith may have appeared straightforward to the inspector, each household member was entangled in a web of personal motives, unspoken resentments, and careful deceptions. By midday, the questioning concluded, leaving the household in a restless hush. The servants whispered in corners, the family exchanged brief, guarded glances, and Inspector Blake looked exhausted but confident that the next step would bring clarity. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her knitting resting on her lap, her mind alive with connections that had yet to be fully understood. The voices of deception had spoken, revealing fragments of truth amid layers of misdirection. She was certain that the key to Lady Edith's death lay not in any one account, but in the careful reconciliation of these fragments, the moments where the stories diverged, where the smallest detail contradicted the larger narrative. And somewhere within that delicate interplay of truth and lies, Miss Marple knew the mystery would begin to unravel. As the afternoon sunlight slanted through the frost-specked windows of Rosewood Manor, Miss Marple moved quietly through the corridors, reflecting on the tangled web of motives she had begun to discern. Each member of the household possessed a plausible reason to wish Lady Edith ill, yet no single thread could explain the perplexing circumstances of her death. Greed, jealousy, fear, and lingering resentment seemed to coil around every corner, each as intricate as the frost patterns on the winter roses outside. Clarissa Harrowby's nervous behaviour suggested more than filial concern. Miss Marple recalled the soil on her gloves, the smudge of ink, the careful insistence on her alibi. The girl had been close to inheriting a portion of Lady Edith's estate, yet she had always been outwardly polite and dutiful. Still, there were moments during questioning when her eyes lingered on the ivory rose. A delicate curiosity mingled with something sharper, perhaps anticipation, perhaps fear. It was possible that Clarissa, like many young heirs, feared being overlooked or deprived, but the evidence was subtle, almost imperceptible. Lord Harrowby, by contrast, carried a cold, measured demeanour that hid more than it revealed. His grief seemed curated, a performance designed to deflect scrutiny. Miss Marple noted the faint trace of Lady Edith's perfume on his coat, the slight crease in his sleeve, and the inconsistencies in his timeline. There had been tensions in the family over the management of the estate, disagreements that had simmered beneath the polite surface for years. Greed was certainly a possibility, though perhaps mingled with a more personal motive, control over family affairs, a desire to dictate the future even after his wife's passing. Mr. Clements, the butler, was a study in self-control, yet Miss Marple sensed a tension beneath his calm exterior. His hesitations during questioning had been telling, the subtle tremor of his hands almost imperceptible but enough to catch her eye. He was fiercely protective of the household, loyal to Lady Edith in ways that might verge on possessive. Had he acted out of fear for the family's reputation, or perhaps in a misguided attempt to shield a secret he alone knew? His motive was not obvious, but it existed in the shadows, a quiet, potentially dangerous loyalty that might tip into desperation if challenged. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, presented a different type of motive, one entwined with pride and opportunity. She had been diligent in her care of the household, yet her over-eagerness to recount every detail suggested an underlying need to assert control. Perhaps she feared being blamed for negligence, or perhaps she sought influence over the household by ensuring she appeared indispensable. Jealousy, a subtle desire for recognition, or even resentment over perceived slights could have guided her actions, though nothing overt suggested violence. Even the gardener, Humphrey, had his own reasons to act. His frequent trips into the house during the morning contradicted his account of remaining outdoors, and the dirt smudges on his coat hinted at more than simple labour. He had long admired Lady Edith's meticulous care of the garden, and may have resented any interference or reprimand. The possibility of a petty revenge or an impulsive act, while unlikely, could not be dismissed outright. As Miss Marple traced these threads in her mind, she began to see the shape of the underlying tension. Each motive intersected and overlapped with another, forming a complex lattice rather than a single linear cause. Greed intertwined with fear, jealousy mixed with loyalty, and the small personal resentments of everyday life had conspired to create a situation in which a carefully placed clue, the ivory rose, might serve to mislead, intimidate, or communicate a private message. The room itself, so meticulously arranged, seemed almost like a map of these hidden motives, each object a marker in a maze of human desires and apprehensions. She reviewed the alibis once more. Clarissa's story held minor inconsistencies. Lord Harrowby's movements suggested proximity. Clement's hesitations implied concealed knowledge. Mrs. Whitcomb's eagerness might disguise more subtle intentions, and Humphrey's actions contradicted his words. Alone, none of these hints were conclusive, but together they suggested a pattern. Each person had both opportunity and motive, yet none could account for the unusual manner of death entirely on their own. The complexity of human emotion and desire, Miss Marple realized, was what made the case so confounding, and yet so revealing for someone attuned to the subtleties of character. The light faded, and the shadows lengthened across the drawing-room floor. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her eyes lingering on the ivory rose once more. Each person in the household had a reason to act, a desire to conceal, or a fear to mask, and the death of Lady Edith could only be understood by untangling these intertwined threads. Slowly, patiently, she began to form a mental lattice connecting motives, alibis, and subtle actions, an invisible map that would, she hoped, guide her to the truth hidden behind the delicate petals of that single enigmatic rose. Late that afternoon, a sudden discovery sent a ripple of excitement through Rosewood Manor. Inspector Blake burst into the drawing-room, a bundle of papers in hand, his face alight with triumph. "We may have found the key to the case," he announced, voice echoing against the high ceilings. The household stirred with a mix of relief and curiosity, everyone eager for clarity after the long hours of tension. Miss Marple, however, remained seated in her chair, her knitting paused, her sharp eyes observing rather than celebrating. Blake presented the evidence with theatrical flair, a partially burned note found in the hearth of the study, its edges charred, containing a threatening message addressed to Lady Edith. The note suggested that someone harboured a grudge against her, warning of consequences if she did not comply with unspecified demands. The inspector had already linked the paper to Clarissa, citing a fragment of handwriting that seemed to match her mother's side of the family. To Blake, the case now had a tangible suspect and motive, a classic combination of anger and opportunity. Clarissa looked pale but resolute, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. Lord Harrowby nodded gravely, seemingly satisfied that the investigation had moved forward. Even the staff exchanged quick, conspiratorial glances, as if the puzzle were suddenly nearing its conclusion. Blake was jubilant, already drafting a plan to formally charge Clarissa while praising his own detective work. "It's all so clear now," he declared, his pride evident. "The evidence practically writes itself. A motive, a fragment of handwriting, and the timing. It fits." Miss Marple, however, remained unmoved. She had read the note carefully, noting the phrasing, the ink, and the paper's peculiar texture. Something about it did not sit right. The threats were generic, almost theatrical, lacking the personal knowledge that a real enemy would possess. The handwriting, though resembling Clarissa's familial script, could easily have been copied by someone trying to frame her. The note's partial burning was too convenient, as if someone had wanted eye. Tea discovered in precisely that state. She quietly rose and walked over to the hearth, crouching to examine the ashes. The paper had burned in an uneven, controlled way, as if the fire had been tended rather than accidental. Moreover, the fragments suggested that the note had been written hastily and then deliberately charred to mimic an attempt at destruction. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room again, noting the subtle disturbances in the dust on the mantelpiece, the faint smudges on the desk, and the slight misalignment of the photograph of Lady Edith's late husband. These were the sorts of details that someone preoccupied with producing a false clue might easily overlook. She turned to Blake gently but firmly. "Inspector, this is a most intriguing development, but I would advise caution. It is not always the case that the first clue discovered is genuine. Sometimes the cleverest deception is the one that seems the most convincing." Blake, flushed with the satisfaction of having solved the case, waved away her concerns. "Nonsense, Miss Marple. The note points to the culprit, and all signs, handwriting, opportunity, motive, lead here. We can move forward with confidence." Miss Marple allowed a small, knowing smile. The excitement in the household began to settle, but she noticed a shift in the behaviour of those around her. The butler, Mr. Clements, had a faint tightening around his mouth, a barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes. Mrs. Whitcomb's eagerness, which had previously been a display of compliance, now bordered on anxious impatience, as if she feared the wrong person would be accused. Lord Harrowby, too, seemed almost too relieved at the prospect of resolution, the calm in his posture carefully measured. As the evening drew in, and the Manor's lamps cast long shadows across the drawing-room, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her gaze once more resting on the ivory rose. It gleamed innocently in the lamplight, yet she felt the subtle weight of its significance. The note may have given the authorities a false sense of triumph, but she knew the true perpetrator was still hidden, waiting, perhaps watching the proceedings unfold with quiet amusement. The staged breakthrough had bought time and misdirected suspicion, but the real danger lingered, masked by propriety and patience. Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the contradictions, the minor hesitations, the subtle signs of anxiety she had noted throughout the day. Whoever had orchestrated this charade possessed not only cunning, but a precise understanding of human behaviour. They had planted the note, timed its discovery, and calculated the reactions it would provoke. To the casual observer it was a solution. To Miss Marple it was merely the opening move of a larger, more intricate game. The real criminal remained in the shadows, and she knew that only by continuing to observe, untangling the web of motives and deceptions, could the truth be drawn into the light. The following morning Miss Marple awoke with a sense of quiet determination. While the household still buzzed with whispers of the breakthrough note, she felt certain that the solution lay elsewhere, hidden in the folds of time rather than the smoke of hastily burned paper. She wandered once more through the corridors of Rosewood Manor, her eyes drawn to small familiar objects, the edges of an old ledger, the slight wear in the carpet where footsteps rarely fell, the photographs lining the walls. It was often in these neglected corners that the past quietly whispered its secrets. Her attention settled on a modest, dust-covered cabinet in the study, one that Blake had overlooked in his rush to catalogue contemporary evidence. Miss Marple opened it carefully, revealing a collection of letters, diaries, and telegrams, bound with faded ribbons and yellowed with age. One envelope, in particular, caught her eye. It bore the seal of a law firm long defunct, its wax cracked but still legible. Inside was correspondence addressed to Lady Edith from her late husband's former business partner, a man whose name had surfaced only in passing during social conversations, but had otherwise been forgotten. The letters spoke of disputes over property, financial entanglements and minor grievances that had simmered quietly for years. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, considering the implications. The current tensions in the household, the subtle rivalries, the small resentments, the carefully hidden fears were not isolated. They had grown from these older roots, nurtured over decades of family history, petty disputes, and unspoken grudges. The seemingly simple problem of the ivory rose and the mysterious note now appeared, layered atop a foundation that had been quietly forming long before Lady Edith's death. Curious, she revisited the staff and family, asking casual questions about past disagreements, old acquaintances, and unresolved matters from years gone by. Clarissa, when pressed about her late mother's disputes, grew visibly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot and avoiding direct answers. Lord Harrowby, though calm in appearance, paused ever so slightly before speaking of his wife's early business dealings, hinting at debts and partnerships that had left lingering tension. Mr. Clements and Mrs. Whitcomb, who had always maintained a strict loyalty to the household, exchanged brief glances at mentions of past incidents, as though certain recollections were better left unspoken. Even the gardener, Humphrey, seemed to stiffen at subtle references to prior grievances within the estate. It was in the overlapping of these recollections that Miss Marple began to perceive connections previously. Why? Unnoticed. The quarrels over property, inheritance disputes, and old financial arrangements, had touched each of the key figures in different ways. Clarissa's potential inheritance was a continuation of disputes that had begun with her mother. Lord Harrowby's concerns about control echoed the unresolved tensions with Lady Edith's late husband's business dealings. Mr. Clement's protective loyalty might have roots in obligations to former employers or promises made decades earlier. Even Mrs. Whitcomb's meticulous management of the household revealed traces of an old rivalry with a distant relative, whose shadow now subtly influenced her behaviour. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, seated herself quietly, and let her mind trace the invisible threads. The house itself, with its carefully preserved order and its meticulously tended gardens, seemed like a living archive of past events. Every item, every arrangement, a reminder of history quietly asserting itself in the present. The ivory rose, the partially burned note, the inconsistencies in alibis, all were modern gestures, but they now appeared to be layered atop a structure of old grudges, loyalty, and unresolved family business. It struck her that Lady Edith's death could not be fully understood without acknowledging these long-standing tensions. The crime was not simply about immediate motives, but about the echo of the past, the influence of events that had long been buried but never forgotten. Whoever had acted to end Lady Edith's life had likely drawn on this history, exploiting subtle fears and rivalries, using them to mask their true intent beneath the surface of propriety and routine. Miss Marple leaned back, her fingers idly tracing the pattern of the winter roses etched into the desk. A faint smile touched her lips. The first threads of understanding were beginning to converge. The present could not be separated from the past, and the solution would emerge only by untangling both. The shadow of history stretched across the household like the winter dusk outside, and within its long reach lay the key to unmasking the true perpetrator. The ivory rose, she realized, was not merely a symbol of the present crime. It was a carefully placed marker in a story that had begun years ago, one that she was now beginning to reconstruct with quiet precision. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly observing the household, letting the bustle of servants and anxious relatives continue around her while she focused on subtler details. She had long since decided that conventional questioning would not suffice. The perpetrator had already demonstrated skill in misdirection, planting evidence to steer suspicion toward Clarissa. What was needed now was a method to unsettle the carefully constructed facade, to prompt a reaction that would reveal what had been hidden until now. She began by arranging the drawing-room as if preparing for a casual tea. The ivory rose remained on the desk, deliberately repositioned to be more central, as if to draw attention without appearing manipulative. Miss Marple then invited the family and staff to sit, ensuring that each person had a vantage point that allowed her to observe them closely. While tea was poured and small talk exchanged, she spoke casually about Lady Edith's daily habits, about letters and notes she had received, and, finally, about the partially burned threatening note. Her tone was light, conversational, with no hint of accusation. "What a clever trick," she murmured, allowing her gaze to linger on the note's charred edges, to make one think the culprit left behind a clue when, in reality, they may have been attempting to mislead entirely. "It's so easy to assume the obvious solution is correct, isn't it?" She allowed a pause, letting the company meant hang in the air, then casually added, "I sometimes think that the cleverest criminal is the one who trusts human curiosity more than human reason." The household remained polite but tense. Clarissa fiddled nervously with her teacup. Lord Harrowby's eyes briefly flickered toward the desk. Mrs. Whitcomb's hands tightened around her lace napkin. Mr. Clements shifted in his chair, and then, almost imperceptibly, Humphrey the gardener leaned forward, a shadow crossing his usually impassive face. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and patient, followed his movement. "Humphrey," she said gently, "you are very devoted to the roses. They say that a careful gardener notices things others overlook. Perhaps you could tell me if anything unusual has been happening in the garden, or anywhere near the house recently." She let her gaze linger on him, calm but probing. Humphrey's reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. His hands twitched, as though fighting the impulse to reach for something that wasn't there. His eyes darted toward the desk, toward the ivory rose, then back to Miss Marple. I'm not sure," he stammered, his usual composure gone. Nothing really. I wouldn't—" He trailed off, frowning as though the words he sought to conceal had nearly slipped past. Miss Marple smiled softly, not pressing, merely allowing the pause to expand, giving Humphrey a moment to confront the mental tension she had subtly introduced. It was a simple psychological tactic: create the illusion that the truth could slip out at any moment, that it might already be known. The reaction of those who had something to hide would often betray them more effectively than direct questioning ever could. For the next hour, she continued, weaving casual observations into conversation, subtly shifting emphasis between objects in the room: the ivory rose, the photograph of Lady Edith's late husband, the blotter with the smudged ink. Each person reacted differently, some with impatience, others with overt calm. But Humphrey's repeated glances toward the desk, the tightness in his jaw, and the near momentary twitch of his hands revealed a crack in his careful exterior. He had not anticipated a tactic that did not demand evidence, but rather relied on his own conscience to betray him. Later, Miss Marple reflected quietly, knitting in her chair by the fire while the household bustled with afternoon tasks. The unconventional clue had not been a physical object, a fingerprint, or a shred of paper. It had been the reaction itself. In human behavior, she knew, the truth often made itself known in the smallest, least expected gestures: a twitch, a pause, a flicker of unease. Humphrey had revealed far more than any document or testimony could have, and Miss Marple understood that this was the opening she needed. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. The web of deception was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, and the real culprit, patient though they were, could not anticipate the quiet precision of observation. Every gesture, every hesitation, every involunta. Wry motion had been recorded in her mind, and soon these fragments would coalesce into a full understanding. The ivory rose remained where it had been placed, gleaming innocently in the afternoon light, while behind it the shadows of guilt had begun to stir. That evening, as dusk settled over Rosewood Manor, the household gathered in the drawing-room under the pretense of another routine check of the estate's documents and belongings. Miss Marple had suggested a careful review of Lady Edith's personal papers, hoping to find subtle clues linking the present tension to the hidden motives she had begun to unravel. Inspector Blake, eager to consolidate the breakthrough he believed he had achieved, busied himself with cataloguing letters and fragments of the partially burned note. The air was thick with polite murmurs and restrained anxiety, the tension barely masked behind the clinking of teacups. Miss Marple, however, was not distracted by the ritual of paperwork. Her attention remained on the household itself, watching the interactions, observing the micro-expressions and small gestures that often betrayed a hidden agenda. She noted that Humphrey, the gardener, kept glancing toward the desk where the ivory rose still gleamed under the lamplight. Even from her chair she could detect a slight restlessness in his posture, the subtle pressure of his fingers against his knees, a silent signal of unease. Suddenly, a sharp exclamation broke the relative calm. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, had opened the locked cabinet in which Miss Marple had earlier found the old letters, only to find it empty. "But this was here!" she cried, her voice a mixture of shock and panic. Inspector Blake rushed over, scanning the empty shelves and then the surrounding floor. The letters, including the envelope from the old law firm, were gone without a trace. The carefully preserved documents might have revealed long-buried connections were now vanished. A wave of alarm spread through the household. Clarissa's face paled. Lord Harrowby's composed demeanour wavered as he strode to the cabinet, inspecting the lock and hinges as though expecting them to reveal a hidden mechanism. Mr. Clements straightened abruptly, his eyes scanning the corners of the room and the far edges of the hallway with sudden intensity. The sense of security so tenuously maintained had evaporated. Miss Marple rose calmly, moving toward the cabinet. She ran her fingers lightly over the edges, noting no signs of forced entry, no scratches, no splintered wood. Whoever had taken the letters had done so with precision, a deliberate effort to remove the evidence without leaving a trace. That much was clear. But more significant in Miss Marple's mind was the implication someone in the household was determined to obstruct the investigation, to suppress information that might expose the true motive behind Lady Edith's death. Someone knew these documents were important, she said softly, addressing the room without accusation, and someone moved quickly to ensure they would not be examined. That alone tells us that the key to understanding what happened lies within this missing correspondence. Blake frowned, frustration evident in the tight lines of his face. "Then we must assume the culprit among the household is cleverer than we anticipated," he muttered, already imagining the complications this theft would introduce. Miss Marple's eyes, however, did not express fear or doubt. She observed the reactions carefully. Clarissa's fingers trembled slightly as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Lord Harrowby's calm eyes shifted too quickly toward the empty cabinet, lingering there longer than etiquette might dictate. Mrs. Whitcomb bit the inside of her lip, an almost imperceptible twitch, while Clements maintained his usual composure, but she noticed a faint crease of concern between his brows, subtle but telling. Humphrey, the gardener, seemed unusually still, his hands clasped together in a tension that could only come from awareness of what had transpired. The incident changed the dynamic of the household instantly. Suspicion no longer followed the neat lines of motive and opportunity. It now radiated in all directions, uncertainty infecting every interaction. Trust, which had been tenuous at best, became almost non-existent. Miss Marple realized that the thief had acted not merely to remove documents, but to manipulate perception, to buy time, and perhaps to divert attention from themselves. As night deepened, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair by the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. The ivory rose on the desk glimmered in the lamplight, a silent reminder that while physical evidence could be stolen or destroyed, the truth was far harder to erase. Someone in the house was attempting to bury the facts, to shield their deception behind shadows and misdirection. Yet Miss Marple understood that the loss of the letters, while inconvenient, also revealed character in motion. The subtle cracks in behavior, the small signs of panic, hesitation, or over-eagerness. The stolen evidence had shifted the battlefield, but it had also exposed the nervous undercurrents that she could now study more keenly. The case, she realized, had entered a more dangerous phase. Whoever had taken the letters was clever and patient, and the stakes had risen. But the true perpetrator, confident in their control, had not anticipated the quiet, persistent observation of Miss Marple. The game had changed, but she was ready, and in the subtle gestures of those around her, she began to sense where the path to truth might now lead. The quiet of Rosewood Manor was shattered the following morning. A piercing scream echoed from the east wing, jolting the household from their uneasy routines. Miss Marple, already alert from the tension of the previous day, rose immediately and followed the sound, her senses sharpened by the knowledge that the stolen letters had only deepened the danger. She arrived in the library just as the staff, wide-eyed and trembling, clustered near the doorway. There, sprawled across the ornate rug, lay Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, unconscious and badly bruised. A toppled chair and scattered papers suggested a sudden struggle. Her eyes fluttered open to reveal confusion and fear, and she gasped, "It was someone I didn't see," before drifting again into semi-consciousness. The room bore signs of violent intrusion, a shattered vase, the disarray of books on the shelves, and a chair pushed askew, as if a determined hand had swept through to ransack the place. Miss Marple's gaze swept the scene calmly, noting the angle of the disturbances, the pattern of broken items, and the absence of anything apparently stolen. Inspector Blake arrived moments later, breathless from running across the frost-laden gravel, already assuming that the attack was connected to the previous day's theft. "Another attempt," he exclaimed. "The culprit is escalating. These people are in danger." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes lingering on the disorder with deliberate precision. "Yes," she said softly, "and the choice of target is significant. Mrs. Whitcomb, though eager to assist in the investigation, knows more than most and may have stumbled too close to what the thief wanted hidden. This attack was intended not to take something, but to intimidate, or perhaps to prevent her from speaking further." The household buzzed with fear, their earlier polite pretense replaced by tension and suspicion. Clarissa clutched her hands tightly. Lord Harrowby paced the room with a pale, rigid expression, and even Clement's usual composure seemed shaken, his eyes darting to the library doorway more than once. Humphrey, the gardener, who had shown the first signs of nervous behaviour the previous day, now appeared nearly petrified, standing silently in the corner, his hands clenched as though restraining himself. Miss Marple's mind, however, was active, tracing the implications of this escalation. The thief, or assailant, was clearly more daring than previously suspected. The attack had not been haphazard. It was targeted, precise, and strategically timed. Whoever was behind these events had intimate knowledge of the household, its routines, and the ways in which fear could be manipulated to conceal the truth. The stolen letters had served their purpose, and now the perpetrator was moving to eliminate witnesses or to create an atmosphere of confusion, strong enough to deflect attention from themselves. As she observed, Miss Marple noted a detail that others had missed: the direction of Mrs. Whitcomb's fall and the light scuff marks on the polished floor, indicating that the assailant had moved with controlled, deliberate steps rather than brute force. Whoever had attacked her was methodical, patient, and confident. Furthermore, the assailant had not attempted to flee the house hurriedly. Their movements suggested familiarity and a sense of ownership over the space, a terrifying comfort with the environment. Miss Marple turned to the assembled household, her voice calm but firm. "This is no longer merely a case of a death in isolation. The person responsible is among us, and they are both clever and cautious. We must consider not only the past grievances and present motives, but also who possesses the audacity to act with such precision and confidence." The tension was palpable, the room heavy with silent accusations and unspoken fears. Inspector Blake looked from one face to another, realizing that his straightforward approach was now insufficient against a mind several steps ahead. Miss Marple, quietly taking stock of each subtle reaction, the tightened jaw of Lord Harrowby, Clarissa's fluttering eyelids, Clement's restless shifting, Humphrey's rigid stance, recognized that the next move would require both patience and ingenuity. As the household began to settle under uneasy watchfulness, Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the ivory rose on the desk, now bathed in the cold light of morning. The symbol that had seemed merely enigmatic before now seemed almost ominous, a marker of a mind that could manipulate, mislead, and strike when least expected. The investigation had taken a sharp turn. The thief was not only hiding the truth but escalating the danger, and Miss Marple realized that she was no longer merely solving a crime. She was racing against someone whose cunning had only just begun to reveal itself. The stakes were higher, the deception deeper, and the fragile trust within the house more perilous than ever. As night settled over Rosewood Manor, the household remained under a tense, watchful quiet. Mrs. Whitcomb had been moved to her room to recover, and the staff moved with cautious deliberation, every footstep echoing against the polished floors. Inspector Blake, frustrated by the sudden turn of events, had begun pacing the drawing room, muttering to himself about the thief's cleverness and the escalating danger. Miss Marple, however, sat calmly in her chair by the fire, her knitting idle, her mind tracing the threads of the day's disturbances with quiet precision. She reviewed the events in sequence: Lady Edith's mysterious death, the misleading note, the stolen letters, the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb, and the small, subtle reactions of each household member. Each incident, in isolation, seemed to be a piece of misdirection, carefully designed to obscure the true intent. Yet as she thought, a small detail she had almost dismissed, the placement of the ivory rose, began to take on a new significance. Its precise position on the desk, slightly askew from the centre, had seemed like an innocuous flourish, a decorative choice. But in hindsight she realized it was not simply ornamental. It had been deliberately positioned to draw attention, to signal something to those who knew how to read it. Her gaze shifted to the blotter on the desk, with its faint smudges of ink. She remembered noticing how the edges of Lady Edith's half-written letter had been slightly raised, as if handled and replaced carefully. The combination of the rose, the letter, and the subtle marks suggested a methodical approach, a mind that left the appearance of randomness while actually guiding the observer towards specific conclusions. The stolen letters, she realized, were not just a theft. They were a necessary step in maintaining the illusion, removing the documents that might contradict the false narrative carefully constructed by the true culprit. Miss Marple's eyes drifted across the room to the photograph of Lady Edith's late husband. The picture, slightly tilted, had seemed insignificant at first, but now its alignment made sense. It was not a careless adjustment, but a deliberate marker, part of a visual rhythm that echoed the positioning of other objects, details meant to be seen or ignored according to the observer's attention. Small, ordinary gestures had been used to communicate intent and manipulate perception. Then, a faint memory surfaced during the casual tea the previous day. When Miss Marple had been employing her psychological tactic, she had noticed Humphrey glancing repeatedly toward a desk, his hands clenched just long enough to betray unease. At the time it seemed like simple nervousness, but now, in conjunction with the other details, it formed part of a larger pattern. Each reaction, each gesture, each minor disturbance was not random, they were all interconnected, revealing the careful choreography of a mind accustomed to control and concealment. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked around the room, tracing the path she had observed Humphrey taking during the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb, the scuff marks on the floor, the angle of the fallen chair, the precise method by which the papers had been scattered. All pointed to someone familiar with the household, someone capable of moving without leaving obvious traces, and someone calculating enough to manipulate the perceptions of others. Every piece of evidence, including the false breakthroughs, the stolen letters, and the attack, fit into a single, coherent sequence. It was then that she saw it clearly. The key to the case had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in dramatic gestures or obvious clues, but in the subtle interplay of objects, reactions, and habits. The culprit had relied on human assumptions, expecting others to overvalue the dramatic and overlook the mundane. The ivory rose, the faint ink smudges, the slight misalignments of photographs and furniture, and the calculated timing of movements all formed a lattice of deception. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her fingers tracing the knitting absent-mindedly as the realization settled. The pattern was now unmistakable. It revealed not only who possessed the knowledge and opportunity, but also who had the skill to orchestrate every event so meticulously, to misdirect suspicion and manipulate the household's attention. The chaos, the theft, and the attack were all part of a single strategy, and the subtle signs she had observed, the seemingly insignificant gestures and placements, were the breadcrumbs leading directly to the mastermind. With a calm determination, Miss Marple knew what needed to be done next. The labyrinth of deception had been mapped, the true architecture of the crime revealed. Now it was a matter of drawing the threads together, anticipating the next move, and confronting the perpetrator before any further harm could be done. The key had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, and she finally understood how to unlock the final pieces of the puzzle. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon walking slowly through the quiet halls of Rosewood Manor, her mind tracing the intricate lattice of evidence and human behavior she had pieced together over the past days. The tension in the household was almost tangible. Even the winter roses outside seemed to sway nervously in the cold breeze, as though they sensed the storm beneath the calm. She had observed every twitch of the hand, every subtle glance, every carefully concealed emotion, and now the threads were beginning to converge into a pattern she could finally decipher. It was Humphrey, the gardener, who occupied her thoughts most insistently. His nervous reactions during the psychological test had been the first clear indication that someone's composure hid a dangerous secret. Yet it was not simple greed, as one might assume. The stolen letters, the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb, the calculated placement of objects, all suggested planning, yes, but they did not align with mere inheritance or property disputes. Miss Marple remembered the old correspondence she had discovered in the dust-covered cabinet, the letters between Lady Edith and her late husband's business partner. They revealed not just financial tension, but a web of past grievances, subtle slights and misunderstandings stretching back years. Could someone so intimate, Ely connected to the household, still act out of unresolved emotional threads? She returned to the drawing-room, moving deliberately to inspect the desk. The ivory rose gleamed innocently, yet in its perfection lay the perpetrator's signature, an obsession with control and precision. Miss Marple recalled the way Humphrey had reacted to its presence, the near involuntary twitch of his hands and the direction of his gaze whenever she had mentioned the stolen letters. Slowly the pieces fell into place. This was not about money or even about fear of exposure. It was about the preservation of an ideal, an obsessive need to maintain a sense of order, to guard the household against what he perceived as corruption or neglect. The truth, when it crystallized, was more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Humphrey's loyalty had evolved into something perilous. He had been in love with the estate, with its traditions and the meticulous care that Lady Edith had lavished upon it. To him, any disruption, be it a letter threatening to expose old secrets, an inattentive hand in the garden, or the possibility of outsiders uncovering family disputes, was intolerable. His actions, though extreme, were motivated by a twisted idealism. He believed that by controlling information, by managing perception, and by eliminating those who might destabilize the household, he was protecting something sacred. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more, noting the scattered papers, the slight scuff marks on the floor from the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb, and the subtle marks of manipulation in the arrangement of furniture and objects. Each action made sense in light of this new understanding. The partial burning of the threatening note was designed to mislead, to focus suspicion on Clarissa. The theft of the letters removed evidence that might contradict his constructed narrative, even the assault. Tea on Mrs. Whitcomb, who had been too close to the truth, fit perfectly within his psychological framework: eliminate uncertainty, enforce compliance and maintain control. She considered the courage it had taken for him to act with such precision. Humphrey had calculated every movement, anticipating human reactions with meticulous care. His obsession had transformed into a deadly form of guardianship, one that viewed the lives of others as expendable in service of his personal vision. Miss Marple could see it clearly now: the act of murder, the theft, the assault, all were tools in a larger strategy to preserve the household's purity as he understood it. As the realization settled, she called the household together under the pretense of another routine review of the estate's documents. Calmly she described the pattern of events, leading them through the sequence of subtle manipulations and carefully observed reactions. When she finally spoke of the true motive, Humphrey's obsessive need to control and preserve the estate, she watched closely. The gardener's face, usually impassive, twitched imperceptibly, and his hands, which had been folded in perfect stillness, betrayed a slight tremor. The psychological mask he had worn so diligently began to fracture. It was then that Miss Marple knew she had reached the heart of the mystery. The crime had never been about money or inheritance alone. It had been an emotional pathology, a dangerous manifestation of loyalty twisted into obsession. The depth of his fixation explained the extreme lengths to which he had gone: the careful placement of clues, the theft, the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb. It was not the act of a calculating criminal in the ordinary sense, but the desperate work of a mind consumed by its own ideals, willing to sacrifice anything to preserve the vision it held dear. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, almost perceptible nod. Understanding the hidden motive was the final key to unraveling the tangled web of actions, deceptions, and misdirections. Now she had both the evidence and the insight necessary to confront the true culprit and bring the danger simmering through Rosewood Manor to an end. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon quietly preparing. She moved with her usual calm, her knitting set aside as she arranged the drawing-room with meticulous care. Chairs were positioned to encourage discussion, objects subtly placed to guide attention, and the ivory rose remained prominently on the desk, an unspoken anchor for the moment to come. She had asked that the household remain in the room under the guise of another review of Lady Edith's personal papers, but each person could feel the growing tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Inspector Blake, sensing the gravity in Miss Marple's demeanour, reluctantly left the planning to her. "I trust your instincts, Miss Marple," he said, though a flicker of impatience passed over his face. "But this is going to have to be swift." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm but alert, sweeping the room to observe subtle shifts in posture, expressions, and breathing. Her attention, however, remained fixed on Humphrey. The gardener had been quiet for hours, standing just outside the main circle, hands folded, shoulders tense. His eyes flicked nervously toward the ivory rose, then to the other members of the household, and finally back at Miss Marple. He was patient, careful, but the tension coiled tightly around him, as if he were preparing for something inevitable. "Humphrey," she began, her voice soft but firm, "we have observed much over these past days. You have been extraordinarily devoted to this house, its traditions, and to Lady Edith herself. That devotion, while admirable in moderation, has led to certain actions that we cannot ignore. Perhaps you would like to explain why the letters were taken, why Mrs. Whitcomb was attacked, and why a false trail was laid for Clarissa." For a moment Humphrey's composure held. Then a subtle shift betrayed the cracks beneath his careful mask. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexed, and his gaze dropped briefly to the ivory rose, as if drawing courage or perhaps weighing his next move. He began, voice low and strained. "I did it for the house, To protect it. To protect her memory. You wouldn't understand. None of you would. Everyone is so careless, so blind to what matters. Miss Marple's eyes remained calm, unflinching. I understand more than you might think, but protecting a house does not require harming those who live within it, nor taking measures that endanger others. There is still time to put the matter right, to avoid further tragedy. Humphrey's gaze flickered across the room, taking in the faces of Clarissa, Lord Harrowby, Mrs. Whitcomb, and even Inspector Blake. He realized, perhaps too late, that the network of observations Miss Marple had quietly constructed was complete. She had anticipated his reactions, accounted for his movements, and understood the psychology that drove him. A desperate tension entered his posture. The tension of someone who knows the walls of deception are closing in. I won't let it be ruined, he hissed, a flash of panic in his eyes. Not the house, not the order of it all. You don't understand. With sudden speed he moved toward the desk, perhaps intending to seize the ivory rose or disrupt the setting Miss Marple had so carefully arranged. But she was prepared. A slight movement, a soft step and a quiet shift of a chair cut off his path. There is no need for further haste, Humphrey, she said quietly, yet with unyielding authority. Everything is already known, and there's no escape from what you have set in motion. The house is safe now because the truth is out. For a tense moment he froze, wild eyes darting, fingers twitching toward the desk as if to snatch something away. Then, with a shuddering breath, the enormity of his position seemed to settle over him. His shoulders slumped, the fervour in his expression dimmed, and he sank slowly into the nearest chair, the fire of obsession replaced by the grey acceptance of inevitable capture. I only wanted to protect it, he whispered. I thought, if everything stayed in order, no one would be hurt. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her gaze softening just enough to acknowledge his confession without condoning it. Intentions, however well-meaning, cannot excuse actions that endanger life. But it is a relief to finally understand the motive. Now, the truth can be acknowledged, and justice can take its proper course. As Inspector Blake moved forward to secure Humphrey, the tension in the room began to ease. Clarissa's hands unclenched, Lord Harrowby's rigid posture softened, and even Mrs. Whitcomb gave a small, relieved sigh. The danger that had lurked in every shadow, in every subtle gesture, had finally been exposed and contained. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her fingers resting on the knitting she had left idle. The room, once filled with fear and suspicion, now held a quiet sense of resolution. The pattern had emerged, the hidden motive revealed, and the culprit confronted. And as the evening light fell across the ivory rose, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that the intricate puzzle of Rosewood Manor had at last been fully unravelled. The calm that settled over Rosewood Manor after Humphrey's confession was almost tangible, but Miss Marple's mind remained alert, scanning the subtle vibrations of the household. The staff had resumed their quiet routines, and the family, though visibly relieved, carried a residual tension in their movements. Inspector Blake, satisfied that the case seemed concluded, busied himself with paperwork, cataloguing statements and securing Humphrey. Yet Miss Marple could not shake the faint unease that had been gnawing at her since the first hints of deception. She lingered by the desk, her gaze drifting over the ivory rose, the blotter with its faint smudges, and the slight misalignments of the room she had noticed since her first visit. Something did not settle entirely with the confession. Humphrey's motive, as obsessive and controlling as it was, explained much, yet there were gaps, small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies that nagged at her. Certain reactions during the confrontation, fleeting expressions, and one or two anomalies in the sequence of events did not align with the meticulous pattern. She had reconstructed. Miss Marple decided to review the household one final time, quietly observing without attracting attention. As she moved through the corridors, she noticed Clarissa lingering near the portrait of her late mother, her expression uncharacteristically pensive. Miss Marple's attention shifted. Clarissa had been cooperative and anxious to clear suspicion from herself, yet something about her composure now struck Miss Marple as deliberate, measured. Returning to the drawing-room, she asked for the ledger once more, the one containing the minor records of the estate's expenditures and letters. As she leafed through it, she noticed a single entry that had gone unnoticed, a transfer of funds to a previously unmentioned account, one that linked indirectly to an unknown associate of Lord Harrowby. The handwriting was careful, almost imperceptibly distinct from the rest of the ledger. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The signature bore an uncanny resemblance to Clarissa's, but it was slightly too neat, controlled in a way that suggested intentional disguise. Her thoughts raced as she reconstructed the timeline. Humphrey's obsession had driven him to act in extreme ways, but the stolen letters had required knowledge and access beyond what he alone possessed. Someone else had orchestrated their removal, timed the attack on Mrs. Whitcomb, and ensured the false trail of the note pointed toward Clarissa. The patterns she had observed in object placement and gestures, the ivory rose, the misaligned photograph, the smudged blotter, were the handiwork of a mind trained in manipulation, someone who could anticipate reactions, guide perceptions, and maintain composure under pressure. Miss Marple stood silently, knitting needles idle in her hand as she considered the implications. Humphrey had been a willing participant in the larger scheme, but he had not conceived it. He had executed it, driven by his obsession. The true mastermind was someone whose intellect and understanding of human behavior surpassed even his meticulous control, and all evidence pointed disturbingly to Clarissa. She called the household together once more, her voice calm but resolute. "We have learned much from recent events, and Mr. Humphrey's confession explains a great deal. Yet there remain inconsistencies that must be addressed. Certain actions, the timing of the theft, the orchestration of the attack, require knowledge and foresight beyond his reach." Her eyes, steady and piercing, settled on Clarissa. "It is clear that some guidance, some subtle direction came from another source. And I believe that source is present here today." A hush fell over the room. Clarissa's hands tightened involuntarily. Lord Harrowby's expression became guarded. Humphrey, seated with the residual weight of guilt, glanced between Miss Marple and Clarissa, confusion flickering across his features. Miss Marple continued, "The ledger shows a transfer, carefully disguised, which only someone intimately familiar with the household, financial records could arrange. The notes and gestures intended to mislead, the placement of objects, the timing of events, reveal a mind trained to manipulate. Mr. Humphrey followed orders. He did not conceive them." Clarissa's face drained of colour, and she finally let slip a trembling sigh. I didn't think it would come to this," she murmured. "I only wanted to protect the family, to prevent disgrace, but I never meant—" Her voice faltered as Miss Marple's gaze held her steady, uncompromising yet compassionate. The revelation struck the household like a thunderclap. Humphrey, though guilty of extreme measures, had been executing someone else's carefully constructed plan all along. The web of deception, the theft, and the attacks were not solely his woe. They were part of a deeper, more insidious orchestration. Miss Marple's quiet genius had pierced the layers of misdirection, uncovering the final, unexpected twist. The mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, exploiting others' weaknesses to manipulate events to their own ends. In that room, filled with tension, fear, and the residual tremors of revelation, Miss Marple allowed a moment to acknowledge the complexity of human motives. The case was not merely a study of obsession and loyalty, it was also a demonstration of cunning psychological manipulation and the dangerous interplay between intent and execution. The final truth had emerged, more shocking than anyone could have anticipated, yet, as always, it had been revealed through careful observation, patience, and a quiet understanding of human nature. The room remained tense as Clarissa's confession settled like a weight over the household. Humphrey, whose guilt had seemed absolute moments before, now slumped with a mixture of relief and fear, realizing that he had been a pawn rather than the architect of the chaos. Inspector Blake stepped forward, ready to take charge, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand, signaling patience. "Before anyone moves," she said softly, "it is important to understand precisely how this was orchestrated." Her eyes swept the room, calm but incisive, taking in the reactions of each individual. The crime, though executed through the actions of Mr. Humphrey, was guided by knowledge, foresight, and a careful study of human behaviour. The stolen letters, the misleading note, the attack, they were all planned to conceal the true intentions, to direct suspicion elsewhere, and to maintain an appearance of chaos while protecting the mastermind's own position. She paused, allowing her words to settle, then began to recount the subtle evidence that had led her to this conclusion. The Ivor. Rose, seemingly decorative, had been deliberately placed to draw attention, to signal the observer and to misdirect others. The ink smudges on the blotter, the slight misalignment of the photograph, and even the faint scuff marks on the library floor were all indicators of movement and intention, revealing a choreography designed to be interpreted correctly only by one with patience and attention. Clarissa's hands trembled, and she lowered her gaze, acknowledging the accuracy of Miss Marple's observations. I did it to protect the family," she whispered. "I thought if I controlled the information, nothing could go wrong." Her voice broke with the realization of how far she had allowed her desire for control to go. Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "Intentions do not excuse actions that endanger life. You manipulated events and guided another to commit acts they might not have undertaken on their own. In essence, you orchestrated the crime from the shadows." Inspector Blake stepped closer, handcuffs in hand, but Clarissa's expression shifted suddenly. A spark of resolve, or perhaps desperation, passed across her face, and she backed toward the open window. In a swift, startling movement, she attempted to flee, driven by panic and the realization that her carefully constructed plan had collapsed. But Miss Marple had anticipated such a reaction. "There is no need to run, my dear," she said calmly, stepping forward with an almost imperceptible shift in her posture. Her quiet authority seemed to arrest Clarissa in place, the sudden clarity in Miss Marple's eyes conveying a resolve that could not be defied. Clarissa's shoulders sagged, the will to resist drained from her. Inspector Blake moved in, gently but firmly, securing her so that escape was impossible. The household exhaled collectively, the tension that had held every corner of the manor captive beggar to dissipate, leaving behind a fragile calm. Miss Marple surveyed the room, noting how even those who had seemed most detached were now processing the revelation. The true villain had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating events with subtlety and intelligence, while those around her had been drawn unwittingly into the scheme. Miss Marple turned to Humphrey, whose guilt had been genuine but misdirected. "You acted under guidance, and while your actions were extreme, they were not conceived independently. Now that the orchestration has been revealed, you are free to give your account honestly, without fear of misinterpretation." Humphrey nodded, relief washing over him, and began to explain his role fully, the chain of obedience and misplaced loyalty that had driven him to act as he did. Finally, Miss Marple addressed the assembled household one last time. The key to understanding this case lay not in dramatic evidence or overt misdeeds, but in observation, patience, and attention to human nature. The subtle signals, the minor inconsistencies, the gestures and positions that seemed trivial, all of these were intentionally placed, and only by noticing them could the truth be revealed. Justice is now served because the patterns have been traced and the manipulations exposed. As the evening deepened and the manor settled into an uneasy calm, Miss Marple reflected quietly in her chair by the fire. The resolution was complete, yet the lingering sense of human complexity and the fragile nature of trust left a faint shadow. Even when justice is delivered, she thought, the echoes of deception and ambition often remain, like footprints in the snow, visible to those who look closely, yet easily overlooked by the casual observer. Rosewood Manor had survived its ordeal, but the memory of the winter roses, the mislaid letters, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior will linger in its corridors for years to come, a testament to the quiet, unerring eye that had unravelled the entire tapestry. The following morning, Rosewood Manor awoke to a fragile sense of normalcy. The snow, freshly fallen, coated the gardens and the winter roses with a delicate white dusting, as though the world had been scrubbed clean of the chaos that had gripped the household. Yet even in the crisp light of day, the echoes of recent events lingered. Chairs had been straightened, letters replaced in the drawers, and the staff moved about quietly, their movements careful, still haunted by the memory of threats, theft, and violence. Miss Marple, her coat wrapped neatly against the chill, prepared to take her leave. She had been a steady presence through the unravelling of a web so intricate that even the most experienced inspector might have overlooked its subtle threads. Her knitting, now folded neatly in her bag, was a small emblem of her patient and unassuming approach, a reminder that the keenest observations often came in moments of quiet reflection. Inspector Blake accompanied her to the carriage, speaking in low tones about the formalities of reporting the case. "It's extraordinary, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "I cannot imagine how you traced the subtle signals to their source." "The household never had a chance, did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is rarely about chance, Inspector. People reveal themselves in the smallest of ways. A twitch of a hand, a misplaced glance, or even the direction in which one approaches a chair. And in this case, the smallest detail, the position of an ivory rose, a ledger entry, or a smudge of ink, made all the difference. Humans are seldom as careful as they think." The carriage rumbled over the frozen gravel as they left the manor behind. Miss Marple gazed out at the snow-dusted landscape, her mind tracing the final layers of the mystery. Free had confessed, Clarissa had revealed her orchestration, and Lady Edith's household could at last begin to heal. And yet she could not entirely shake the sense of unease that sometimes accompanies the resolution of a complex case. It was the little things that nagged at her: a faint, almost imperceptible mark on the back of the desk drawer, an ink blot that had not matched any known writing, a folded scrap of paper found tucked in the corner of the library floor, containing an incomplete cipher she had dismissed as trivial, a detail so minor that it had seemed inconsequential at the time, but in her experience such fragments were rarely meaningless. The human mind, after all, was rarely content with leaving threads untied. Her thoughts returned briefly to the ivory rose, gleaming in the morning light through the manor windows as they receded in the distance. It had been a symbol, a lure, a silent communicator. But had it contained yet another layer she had overlooked? Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. She had solved the immediate puzzle, yes, but mysteries, she knew, have a peculiar way of persisting, even when the obvious elements are resolved. One cannot simply tie up a thread without encountering another hidden beneath it. The carriage carried them toward the village, the crisp winter air filling the space with clarity and quiet. Miss Marple felt that familiar hum of anticipation, the delicate thrill that comes when one suspects that a story is not yet fully told. Perhaps another clue would emerge, or a detail she had deemed trivial would reveal a new pathway. Even as justice had been delivered and the household secured, she understood that the human heart and mind were far more intricate than any single case could fully reveal. Inspector Blake glanced at her, noting the contemplative expression in her eyes. "Do you think we've seen the last of this, Miss Marple?" he asked. She shook her head gently, her gaze distant yet focused. "Cases rarely end so neatly, Inspector. There is always a ripple, a hint, a subtle gesture that might lead to something else. One must remain vigilant, for the smallest details often conceal the greatest truths. And sometimes it is the quietest signals that matter the most." As the carriage rattled on through the snow-dusted roads, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction in having unravelled the web at Rosewood Manor. Yet the lingering thought of that tiny, overlooked mark on the desk, the unfinished cipher, and the ever-watchful human mind left a faint shiver of curiosity. The case was concluded, but the horizon of mystery remained endless. The world held its secrets, and Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, would be ready when they chose to reveal themselves again. Outside, the winter roses glimmered under the cold sun, silent witnesses to the events that had transpired, and perhaps to the mysteries yet to come.